On the night of August 24th, 1975, Ann Sturtz went to a local bar, the TikTok Club on Utah Street in downtown Baltimore, to relax and socialize. Investigators later learned that at that bar, she crossed paths with a man who would soon end her life. According to evidence revealed in 2025, this man, 29-year-old Charles William Davis Jr., lured Ann away from the safety of the public venue under false pretenses. The two drove to a secluded area in Howard County, and there, what had began as a chance meeting turned violent. Davis and Ann got into a heated argument, which escalated into a physical confrontation. In the struggle that followed, Davis strangled Ann, ending her life in an act of brutal violence. Unaware of these details at the time, Ann's family and friends only knew that she had suddenly vanished. Her disappearance prompted a massive search and police investigation, though no meaningful clues turned up in the first few months. That December, nearly 4 months after she went missing, a heartbreaking discovery was made. Ann's remains were found on December 15, 1975, in a wooded area near what is now the Oakland Ridge Industrial Park in Columbia. Unfortunately, due to the state of her body, she was initially registered as a Jane Doe, causing valuable initial investigative time to be lost. This location was miles away from where she'd last been seen in Baltimore, indicating she had likely been abducted and transported by her attacker. The condition of Ann's body suggested she had met with an extremely violent end. The exact details were initially scarce due to decomposition. However, authorities noted trauma on her body, consistent with foul play. It was evident that Ann had been slain and left in the woods by her attacker. Identifying the remains was the next challenge for investigators. With Ann missing for months, her body was not immediately recognizable. The Howard County Police turned to the public for help, and they released a sketch of the young woman's likeness in a local newspaper, hoping someone would recognize her. That strategy paid off. Ann's co-workers saw the sketch and helped police confirm the identity of the victim, and by late 1975, authorities knew who the young woman in the woods was. Once Ann Sturtz was identified as the victim, Howard County detectives focused on finding the perpetrator. They retraced her last known steps on that August night. Investigators learned that Ann had spent her final evening at a Baltimore bar, and it was believed she left the establishment with an unknown man. This suggested that a stranger encounter at the bar was likely the starting point of the crime. Detectives interviewed witnesses who had been at the club and Ann's friends and family, searching for anyone who might have seen her leave or noted the man she was with. Early on, however, tangible clues were scarce. The crime scene where her body was found, an isolated patch of woods, yielded little physical evidence. In the 1970s, forensic science was rudimentary by today's standards, and crucial evidence like DNA samples either were not collected or had deteriorated. With few leads and no immediate suspects, the investigation struggled to make headway. For a time, police pursued any theory that might fit the limited facts. One theory was that Roseanne had been the victim of a random predator who preyed on women leaving bars at night. This notion gained weight a few years later, when law enforcement in Maryland arrested Charles William Davis Jr. for a series of violent crimes. Davis was convicted of multiple slayings committed in the late 1970s and was sent to prison for life in 1978. Some of the acts he was found guilty of bore eerie similarities to what happened to Ann. All cases involving Davis involved him attacking young women after they went out for the evening, and these parallels didn't go unnoticed. By 1981, investigators began to suspect that Ann Sturtz might have been one of Davis's earlier victims. Howard County cold case detectives re-examined Ann's file and saw patterns that matched Davis's known crimes. With Davis already behind bars for life, detectives reached out to question him about Ann's unsolved slaying. In 1981, Howard County authorities made a bold move to get the truth. The state's attorney's office offered Charles Davis Jr. full immunity from prosecution if he agreed to speak about the case. This meant that anything Davis revealed about the 1975 events couldn't be used to charge him in court, a controversial decision, but one aimed at finally obtaining answers. Investigators then interviewed Davis on tape that year, hoping he would confess or provide details known only to the perp. During that interview, Davis did share some information consistent with involvement in Ann's death. However, when detectives showed him a photograph of Roseanne, reportedly a high school portrait taken years before her death, Davis hesitated. He claimed he couldn't positively identify the woman in the picture as someone he recognized, which is a highly disturbing fact in and of itself. Without a clear confession or identification, the case remained stuck. The 1981 conversation, preserved on an audio cassette, ultimately led nowhere definitive. It was an investigative dead end. No charges were brought, or could be brought on the basis of his so-called confession, and Ann's case lingered on the shelves, unresolved. As years turned into decades, the file on Roseanne Sturtz became one of Howard County's oldest cold cases. Leads dried up, memories faded, and witnesses who might have known something either moved away or passed on. The evidence available was limited to old reports, that one taped interview, and circumstantial hints. By all accounts, it appeared the perpetrator would likely never be officially identified, even if the authorities had a good idea of who did it. Yet her family never forgot her, and neither did the police, and the case was never closed, only dormant. Indeed, it would be a fresh set of eyes and dogged persistence nearly half a century later that finally cracked the mystery. In 2022, Corporal Wade Zufall of the Howard County Police Department took over reviewing the department's cold case files. When he came upon Roseanne Sturtz's case, the second oldest cold case on record for the county, he felt compelled to dig deeper. Zufall meticulously pored over every piece of evidence from 1975 that still existed, determined to find something that earlier investigators might have missed. His diligence yielded a remarkable discovery. Tucked away in the case records, Zufall found the long-forgotten 1981 letter from the state's attorney granting Charles Davis immunity in exchange for information. Alongside it was the actual audio cassette recording of detectives' interview with Davis from that year. These two pieces, the letter and the tape, were the quote-unquote lost evidence that could potentially revive the investigation. When Zufall listened to the 1981 recording, he heard Davis acknowledge knowing about Ann's case, though stopping short of a full confession. It was clear that decades ago, police had been on the right track with Davis. Now, with the benefit of modern technology, Zufall believed it might be possible to succeed where the earlier efforts fell short. Knowing that DNA analysis or new forensic testing wasn't an option, Zufall decided to use a different modern technique, a renewed personal approach and updated visuals. He began a correspondence with the now elderly Davis, who was in his late 70s and still serving multiple life sentences. Establishing a rapport over time, Zufall hoped to persuade Davis to speak openly. In late 2024, he arranged to interview Davis in person at the police department's headquarters. Zufall treated the serial offender not just as a criminal to be interrogated, but as someone whose cooperation could finally bring closure to a grieving family. This time, Zufall came prepared with a crucial piece of new evidence, a photograph of Ann Sturtz that looked the way she did when Davis encountered her. Rather than using the outdated high school photo that had failed to jog Davis's memory in 1981, Zufall showed him a different picture from when she was 20 years old. In that newer image, Ann's face was more immediately recognizable to someone who had met her in 1975. The strategy worked, and as Davis gazed at the photo of Roseanne, something clicked. Noticing a distinctive scar visible in the image, Davis realized he did know this woman. The memory of that night in 1975 resurfaced. He nodded and confirmed that the person in the photograph was indeed the young woman he had assaulted so many years ago. Faced with the visual confirmation, and reminded that he still had legal immunity for anything he revealed about this case, Davis finally confessed. After nearly 50 years, the case of Anne's slaying had its answer straight from the perpetrator's mouth. On March 11th, 2025, Howard County authorities announced that the 1975 cold case of Ann Sturts was officially solved. The state's attorney affirmed that the decades-old promise of immunity would be honored, meaning Davis will not face new charges in this case. Nevertheless, Davis remains behind bars for the 3 other convictions he is already serving, ensuring that he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Megan Rose was a 25-year-old nursing assistant living on Australia's Sunshine Coast in 1997. She shared a unit in Markula with her de facto partner, 45-year-old Keith Lees, and his young child. In the late evening of July 17, 1997, Megan left her Markula home around 8 p.m., driving off in her white Suzuki hatchback. When she did not return, concern grew rapidly. Early the next morning, July 18, 1997, her car was found abandoned in a nearby parking lot, and a tragic discovery was made at the base of the Point Cartwright Cliffs on the Sunshine Coast. Megan's body was found on the rocks below the cliff face at around 7 a.m. Police at the time saw no obvious signs of foul play and noted her high blood alcohol level. Investigators assumed that the young woman had come to end herself voluntarily and summarily shut the case down. For years, the case remained closed, with Megan being considered the author of her own fate. Yet those who knew Megan had doubts from the beginning. Her family and friends never believed she would have done such a thing, with their concerns generally being dismissed as loved ones that couldn't handle reality. However, Megan had been making plans to meet friends and was considering leaving her relationship with Keith Lees around the time of her death. The lingering suspicions eventually prompted police to take a second look. It wasn't until 2022 that a dedicated cold case unit launched a fresh review of Megan's death, uncovering new information that cast the tragedy in a very different light. Detectives learned that Megan's partner had taken out a life insurance policy in her name about a year before she died, and he received a payout of over $200,000. This startling discovery, combined with other evidence, led Queensland police to conclude that Megan Rose may not have done it herself, but they needed more evidence. In June 2023, Queensland authorities publicly announced they were treating Megan's death as a slaying and offered a $500,000 reward for information to finally crack the case. By this point, their prime suspect was Megan's former partner, Keith Lees. Detectives interviewed the 72-year-old Lees in Victoria on June 25, 2023, as part of the reinvestigation. But within days, just as the renewed public appeal and reward made headlines, Lees vanished. And I have to say, if you're trying to establish that you're innocent, this isn't a good look at all. His vehicle was found abandoned near the Cape Nelson Lighthouse at Portland in Victoria the next day. Investigators soon discovered that Lees was traveling under false identities and moving across state lines to evade detection. A nationwide manhunt ensued, spanning 18 months and multiple states and territories. Even his own family implored him to surrender, with multiple family members coming out in favor of justice for Megan. Ultimately, a critical tip from the public provided the break investigators needed. Acting on this tip, authorities finally tracked the fugitive to a property in a Sydney suburb. On January 2, 2025, police moved in and arrested 72-year-old Keith Lees ending his time on the run. After his arrest, Keith Lees was extradited to Queensland to face charges in Megan Rose's death. Prosecutors now allege that Lees attacked Megan on the night of July 17, 1997, near the lighthouse atop the Point Cartwright Cliffs. They further allege that he staged the scene to look like a tragic, though intentional, fall. In addition to the most severe charge, Lees was also hit with several charges in New South Wales related to his time as a fugitive. At present, Keith Lees remains in custody pending trial and is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, and turn on all notifications. On the morning of March 21, 1977, Honolulu police were called to McKinley High School. At 7:30 that morning, a teacher had discovered a shocking sight: the body of 16-year-old Dawn Momahara on the second floor of a building on the campus. She was found lying on her back, partially clothed, with an orange cloth tightly wrapped around her neck. An autopsy confirmed that Dawn had been strangled. Investigators determined that Dawn had last spoken to her mother the previous day after receiving a phone call from an unknown male. Dawn told her mother she was going to a nearby shopping center with friends and never returned home. Police launched an intensive investigation in 1977, interviewing students, staff, and anyone who might have seen Dawn before her death. A witness reported seeing Dawn on the campus the night before, getting into a car near the school's English building. The car was described as a distinctive 1974 or 1975 Pontiac Le Mans with a maroon body and white vinyl top, which had been spotted parked on the grass near the building. The witness and his girlfriend noticed a man with the vehicle. When they circled back for a closer look, both the car and the man were gone. Investigators released composite sketches of a person of interest and the possible vehicle based on these descriptions. Within a week of the slaying, police questioned two brothers, William and Gideon Castro, who were former McKinley students, known to have interacted with Dawn. William Castro admitted he'd last seen Dawn just 3 days before her slaying when she passed by his house. He offered her a ride to school, which she declined. Gideon, who had graduated from McKinley in 1976, stated he knew Dawn from a dance and recalled last seeing her in February 1977. Despite these interviews, at the time there was no direct evidence linking the Castro brothers, or anyone else, to the crime. Police had the sketches and some physical evidence from the scene, but 1970s forensic technology was limited. No suspect was conclusively identified in 1977, and Dawn's case began to stall out. As months turned into years, the investigation into Dawn Momahara's slaying went cold. It was only with advancements in forensic science that Dawn's case saw new hope. In 2019, 42 years after the slaying, Honolulu cold case detectives revisited the evidence from 1977. Several pieces of Dawn's clothing retained from the crime scene were submitted for modern DNA analysis. By May 2020, a crime lab was able to develop a partial DNA profile of an unknown male from material on Dawn's clothing. Detectives then turned to genealogical DNA techniques to find potential matches, though since the technology was very new at the time, progress was slow. In 2023, the DNA evidence yielded a crucial lead. Analysts identified two possible suspects who were biologically compatible with the crime scene DNA. These were the same Castro brothers who had been interviewed back in 1977. Investigators proceeded methodically to confirm which of the brothers actually matched the DNA. In November 2023, Honolulu police traveled to Chicago, where William Castro was living, and surreptitiously obtained a DNA sample from one of William's adult children. Importantly, Testing confirmed that William didn't directly match the DNA from the crime scene, effectively ruling him out. Attention then turned fully to Gideon Castro. Evidence showed that Gideon's biological son's DNA was consistent with being the child of whoever left the DNA on Dawn's clothing. Absolute confirmation was obtained when Gideon's DNA was directly proven to be a direct match soon afterwards. In January 2025, armed with the DNA evidence, Honolulu authorities issued a warrant for Gideon Castro's arrest on a charge of second-degree slaying. Castro was located in Mill Creek, Utah, just outside Salt Lake City, where he had been living in a nursing home in poor health. On January 23, 2025, police in Utah, working with Honolulu detectives, arrested Gideon Castro at the nursing facility, nearly 48 years after Dawn's life was brutally taken. He was held on a fugitive warrant from Hawaii, with bail set at $250,000 as he awaited extradition. At a court hearing in Salt Lake City the following month, Gideon Castro appeared via video from a hospital bed and waived his right to challenge extradition, agreeing to be sent back to Hawaii. Notably, his defense attorney stated that despite not fighting extradition, Gideon intends to plead not guilty to the charges. This case shows the overwhelming investigative power of forensic genealogy techniques. Without this technological breakthrough, there would have been no way for the authorities to ever get justice for Dawn and her family. While this justice has sadly taken almost half a century, it's better late than never. That said, there's still a lot of unknowns about Dawn's case, and I hope to have an update as to why this act occurred in an upcoming episode. Karen Persifield was just 25 years old when she traveled from Ohio to Aptos, California, in the spring of 1976 to visit her sister. A young mother, Karen was known for her warm personality. In fact, she was so pleasant, her family affectionately called her Cookie, because, in the words of her sister, she was just that sweet. During her visit, on a late May evening, Karen joined her mother and sister for drinks at the Bayview Hotel, a local tavern in Aptos Village. That night, an argument erupted between Karen and her mother, and a frustrated Karen decided to step out and cool off. She walked off into the darkness alone. It was the last time her family would see her. Several days passed with no sign of Karen. Then, on May 28, 1976, a horrifying discovery was made near the edge of the forest of Nisene Mark State Park in Aptos. Sheriff's deputies, responding to a call about a possible body, found the remains of a young woman in a ravine not far from the village park. The death was quickly ruled a slaying, and she was noted to have been stabbed twice in the chest. Investigators soon identified the victim as Karen Persifield, who had been missing for days. The grim news shook Karen's family and the quiet seaside community. A fun night out had ended in unspeakable tragedy, and the hunt for the perp was about to begin. Santa Cruz County detectives launched an intensive investigation into Karen's slaying. They combed the ravine crime scene for clues and collected forensic evidence available with the technology of the time. Officers interviewed locals and pursued numerous leads, hoping to find who had crossed her path that night. Despite these efforts, no suspects could be definitively linked to the crime, and critical evidence like blood or fingerprints failed to point to anyone. The case began to stall with no arrest in sight, and a disturbing pattern of violence soon emerged in the area. Just a few months after Karen's death, 2 more women were found brutally slain in Santa Cruz County. In August 1976, 31-year-old Vicky Bezor and 21-year-old Mary Gorman were discovered stabbed, with their bodies dumped off a remote highway. When a 29-year-old local man named Richard Summerhalter was arrested in September 1976 and charged with those offenses, detectives couldn't ignore the parallels to Karen Persifield's case. According to reports at the time, he had been considered a person of interest in her case, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. With no physical proof tying him to the ravine where Karen was found, the investigation hit a dead end, and by the end of the 1970s, Karen Persifield's case had officially gone cold. For nearly the next 5 decades, Karen's slaying remained an unsolved cold case. Her family was left to endure an agonizing limbo with no justice and no answers. Karen's daughter Meadow had been only 6 years old when her mother was taken from her, and she grew up haunted by the mystery. In later interviews, she described it as a lifelong obsession to find out what happened and why. Many who remembered the crime believed they knew who was responsible, even if the law had yet to catch up. Somerhalder was convicted of the 2 other slayings, but under the laws of the era, he served only 8.5 years in prison before being paroled in the mid-1980s. And no, you don't have to replay that section because you heard me correctly. 2 people. 8.5 years. Knowing he had spent so little time behind bars was hard for Karen's family to accept. Still, they held on to hope that one day, the truth about Karen's death would be proven. The case gathered dust in the sheriff's files, occasionally revisited, but never yielding new evidence. By the 2010s, however, advances in DNA technology offered a glimmer of hope that the mystery could still be solved. In 2019, cold case investigators decided to re-examine the evidence from 1976 with modern methods. Several items from the crime scene were sent to the California Department of Justice Forensic Lab for DNA testing. That testing yielded a crucial clue. A male DNA profile was successfully developed from the old evidence. At last, detectives had a genetic fingerprint of the killer, but when they ran it through criminal databases, no match turned up. The unknown man's DNA was not in any law enforcement database. It was a frustrating roadblock, so they pursued another avenue. The team turned to a cutting-edge technique known as forensic genetic genealogy. By the fall of 2023, detectives had partnered with Othram, a private lab specializing in advanced DNA analysis, to dig deeper into the mystery. Othram scientists used forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a comprehensive genetic profile from the decades-old evidence and then compared it against genealogy databases. This effort pinpointed a single name that fit the DNA and the clues: Richard Somerhalder, a man whose DNA for some reason wasn't on file, despite his convictions. In early 2025, the authorities publicly confirmed that Somerhalder had been responsible for Karen's slaying. However, there would be no final act of justice for this perpetrator. Somerhalder, it turned out, had died in 1994, so he would never face trial. But the decades-long question over who was responsible for the untimely death of Karen Persifield had finally been answered, and sometimes it really is the one you most suspect. The identification of the perpetrator in 2025 brought a rush of both relief and heartache to those who loved her. After 49 years of not knowing, Karen's family could finally put a name to the horror that had changed their lives. Her daughter Meadow called the outcome a bittersweet justice. Others were deeply disheartened as to how this man who had taken at least 3 lives could have gotten away with serving such little time behind bars. The case file has now been closed, and the exact circumstances of what happened to Karen and why Karen was targeted will almost certainly never be known. Notably, some have speculated that Richard Somerhalder may be responsible for more acts of violence throughout the 1970s, and perhaps even the 80s and 90s. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, and turn on all notifications. Also remember to check out my channel Lazy Chill Zone for unsolved mysteries, and Lazy Chill History for historical facts and historical mysteries. On a summer day in 2008, a beachcomber made a startling and horrific find on the shores of Washington's Olympic Peninsula. Near the old Silver King Resort west of Port Angeles, the traveler spotted a single shoe that had washed ashore. Inside were a sock and the remains of a human foot. Forensic specialists at the King County Medical Examiner's office determined it was indeed human, likely from a young male, but they had no clue whose it was. Investigators scoured missing person databases and DNA profiles in the United States, hoping for a match, but came up empty. This lone foot became an anonymous mystery, a John Doe with no name, no story, and no answers for nearly 17 years. Unbeknownst to the Washington authorities, across the border in Canada, a family was living a nightmare that started 1 year before the foot's discovery. In Mission, British Columbia, a small city along the Fraser River, 17-year-old Jeff Sertel disappeared without a trace in the spring of 2007. On April 29, 2007, Jeff's parents awoke to find their son gone and his bed empty. They later realized he had slipped out around midnight, likely riding away on his blue mountain bike while the household slept. Jeff left most of his personal belongings behind, a sign that something was amiss. It was completely out of character for him to run off, and alarm bells rang immediately. His family reported him missing that same day, sparking an urgent search for the tall, brown-haired teen who had simply vanished into the night. Local RCMP and Mission responded swiftly. Investigators, alongside search and rescue teams, combed the area for any sign of Jeff. A large contingent of friends, classmates, and neighbors volunteered to help, fanning out across nearby streets, wooded trails, and even the banks of the Fraser River in hopes of finding him. Police received dozens of tips and reported sightings from the public, stretching across the lower mainland of British Columbia and beyond. Each lead kindled hope, yet none panned out. Every reported sighting turned out to be someone else. Every clue led to a dead end. It was as if Jeff Sertel had disappeared into thin air. For Jeff's parents, Gary and Dawn Sertel, the uncertainty was agony. "Not a day goes by that we don't think of Jeff," his father said in an interview 5 years after the disappearance. The family lived in limbo, torn between hope and grief as weeks turned into months and then years without answers. The RCMP continued to treat Jeff's case as an open investigation, periodically revisiting it. But as time wore on, with no new evidence, the trail grew cold. Jeff's bicycle was never found, and no witnesses ever came forward to explain what happened that night. His mother and father remained stuck in what they called any parent's worst nightmare, unable to mourn or move on without knowing their son's fate. By the late 2010s, Jeff Sertel's disappearance had become a stubborn cold case. The police file sat open with precious little information. Foul play was considered but not substantiated. An accident was possible, but no body was ever recovered. Divers had searched the Fraser River, and even sonar was used under the Mission Bridge where he might have fallen, but nothing was found. As the years passed, the Mission community refused to forget the quiet teenager who had biked off into darkness one April night. His parents organized anniversaries and kept his story alive in local media. In 2018, they enlisted the help of a volunteer organization called Please Bring Me Home, which works to generate anonymous tips in cold cases. A dedicated volunteer investigator, Angela Haino, took on Jeff's case in 2023, her first assignment with the group. She painstakingly reviewed old files and spoke with anyone who might shed light on Jeff's fate, hoping that with time and a fresh perspective, a new lead might surface. Still, no breakthrough came. In a 2023 interview, Haino said, "It's so complex. There's been really nothing that substantial to indicate what happened to him," echoing the family's continued frustration. Meanwhile, that single severed foot discovered in Washington remained in storage at the Callum County Sheriff's Evidence Facility, labeled only as belonging to Callum County Doe, 2008. No one in Mission knew about the foot, and American investigators didn't know about Jeff. The two pieces of the puzzle, a missing Canadian teen and an unidentified human foot, stayed tragically unconnected. The cross-border nature of the mystery meant that crucial clues slipped through the cracks. It would take new technology and international cooperation to finally link them together. Over the long years of uncertainty, the public's interest in Jeff Sertel's case and the enigmatic foot discovery never fully waned. In Mission, community members kept Jeff's memory alive on Facebook groups and forums, sharing updates or simply offering support to the Sertel family. Each time a set of unidentified remains turned up anywhere in the Pacific Northwest, there was a flurry of speculation, and people always questioned whether it could be Jeff. Online sleuths discussed his case, and some noted an eerie trend unfolding along the coasts of British Columbia and Washington. Severed human feet were washing ashore with unsettling regularity. Beginning in 2007, at least a dozen detached feet were found on beaches around the Salish Sea region. The foot discovered near Port Angeles in August 2008 was part of this macabre series. Early on, wild theories spread in the media about these finds. Some wondered if a serial predator was at work, dumping dismembered victims at sea. Others claimed a major disaster, maybe even the 2004 Asian tsunami, had swept the victims across the ocean. In the absence of answers, imagination filled the void with every theory you could imagine. Within Jeff's community, theories about his fate were more grounded but no less painful for his family. One prevalent idea was that Jeff might have suffered an accident and fallen into the Fraser River that night. The river runs swift and deep through Mission, and tragically, drowning victims are sometimes carried long distances by its powerful current. This theory could explain why intensive searches near home turned up nothing, as Jeff's remains may have traveled silently downstream and out to sea. At the time, however, it was only speculation. Other locals feared Jeff might have met with foul play after sneaking out that night. By 2023, the Clallam County Sheriff's Office was willing to try something new to crack the case. Traditional forensic methods had failed to identify the lone foot, but DNA technology had advanced dramatically. Clallam County authorities partnered with Othram to use genetic genealogy to crack the cold case of the severed foot. Funding was a hurdle. This specialized testing is expensive, so the sheriff's office turned to the public for help. In 2024, they launched a crowdfunding campaign, and contributors raised approximately $7,500 to fund the advanced DNA analysis. With money in hand, scientists extracted every bit of genetic information they could from the weathered foot bones. In early 2025, the lab compared the unknown profile against genealogical databases, searching for relatives. It was a long shot, but the result was remarkable. The DNA matched to an extended family tree and pointed to a specific family in Canada. In fact, the sample matched one of Jeff Sertel's uncles. Nearly 18 years after Jeff vanished, the investigators finally had a name for the Washington remains, and Jeff had been found. The breakthrough was confirmed through a joint effort by U.S. and Canadian authorities. Mission RCMP worked with the BC Coroner's Service to verify the genetic findings against Jeff's family DNA, conclusively identifying the foot as Jeffrey Sertel's. On March 11, 2025, Mission RCMP Inspector Ted Levko made the public announcement that many had lost hope of ever hearing. For Gary and Dawn Sertel, the confirmation of their son's death was devastating yet important. They finally knew what happened to Jeff, or at least part of the story. There were no signs of trauma on the remains, and police found no indication of criminality in his death. The most likely scenario is that Jeff did tragically end up in the Fraser River that night in 2007, succumbing to a fatal accident that carried him far from home as hypothesized. Still, the case isn't completely closed. The exact circumstances of his disappearance remain a mystery. Investigators say there are no further leads to pursue unless someone with new information comes forward. They made a public appeal in 2025, urging anyone who knows more about Jeff's last night to speak up, so that even the final unanswered questions might be resolved. Back in Mission, the community that rallied for Jeff over the years came together once more. The Sertel family organized a memorial service to honor the boy they lost and to finally say their final goodbyes. The family expressed heartfelt thanks to all those who had supported them: the friends, volunteers, classmates, teachers, officers, and even strangers who never stopped caring. Still, the investigation into what actually happened to Jeff Sertel does remain ongoing, and it's hoped that at some point his loved ones may know the full truth of what happened. On the morning of February 1st, 1997, 41-year-old Stephen Edenfield was found dead in his Tampa, Florida condo. His brother James discovered Stephen lying in bed, covered in blood, after Stephen failed to show up at their mother's home as expected. The scene spoke of extreme violence. There were signs of a fierce struggle, blood splattered, and even pieces of a shattered porcelain statue strewn in the hallway. Most eerily, the word greed had been written in Stephen's blood on the bedroom wall. Yet investigators found no sign of forced entry, suggesting Stephen had likely let his killer inside willingly. This gruesome scene set the stage for a perplexing mystery that would haunt detectives and the Edenfield family for decades. The night before the slaying, January 31st, 1997, seemed ordinary by family accounts. Stephen had dinner with his brother and sister that evening. Their mother had just returned home from the hospital, and the family lived in the same Tampa Racket Club condo complex, so they often saw each other. After dinner, Stephen decided to go out around midnight. When he returned home at 12:50 a.m., a dark-colored sedan followed him to the gate of the complex. Stephen stopped at the gatehouse since he'd forgotten his remote opener and asked the security guard on duty to let in both his car and the one behind him. Ominously, he explained that the other driver was with him. The guard lifted the gate for both vehicles, but later admitted he hadn't gotten a good look at the second driver, noting only that the person had dark hair. Within an hour of Stephen's return, neighbors in the building heard disturbing noises. Multiple neighbors reported the sounds of an argument and crashing furniture, and even what they thought were cries for help, abruptly followed by silence. Around 2 a.m., the security guard making his rounds spotted a shadowy figure on an upstairs walkway near Stephen's unit, who appeared to be hiding. Before the guard could confront the person, the figure slipped away, and the guard then saw the dark sedan driving out of the complex. The security guard doesn't appear to have taken any further investigative steps at that time. By the time James Edenfield entered his brother's condo at about 9:30 the next morning, it was too late. Investigators arriving at the crime scene documented the extremely grim evidence. Stephen was found on his back, in his bed, covered only by a blanket. He had suffered multiple stab wounds and blunt force trauma to his upper body, indicating a frenzied assault. The bloodstains on the headboard and the chilling message "Greed," scrawled in blood on the wall, suggested the perp had taken the time to stage the scene or deliver a message. Yet there was no ransacking of the home beyond the signs of struggle, and the door had been left closed but unlocked when James arrived. Detectives found a bloody white tank top on the bedroom floor and 2 blood-stained socks near the living room couch, presumably items the attacker might have worn or handled. These items were collected as evidence, including traces of unknown DNA, but in 1997, forensic technology was limited, and no suspect profile was immediately identified. Early leads were scarce, and police questioned residents and the security guard. However, the vague description of a dark-haired man and a sedan yielded no immediate suspect. They also looked into Stephen's personal life. Stephen was openly gay, and while he was close with his family, he kept details of his social and dating life private. This made it harder for detectives to pin down whom he might have been with that night. One acquaintance later told investigators that Stephen had mentioned dating a man named Carlos around that time, raising hopes of a lead. However, despite pursuing this angle, Carlos was never located or definitively linked to the crime, and it remains unclear if he was actually the mystery visitor or simply a red herring. That said, given the subsequent developments, I strongly believe it's the latter. In the first days of the investigation, authorities also noted that one of Stephen's valuable personal possessions had gone missing. This was a custom-made solid gold bracelet engraved with his name. This suggested a possible robbery motive, or at least that the perpetrator had taken a souvenir. The bracelet, gifted by Stephen's mother and unique in design, with double chains and a nameplate, became a critical missing item that detectives quietly kept in mind. Despite these clues, the case quickly went cold. For years, the Edenfield case haunted both Stephen's family and the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. James Edenfield, who had suffered the trauma of finding his brother's body, was left waiting for justice that seemed increasingly elusive. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, detectives periodically re-examined the case file, hoping new information or techniques might crack it, but to no avail. His elderly mother, Barbara, struggled with the loss. She suffered a stroke shortly before the slaying and never fully recovered from the shock. Sadly, she passed away in 2003, having never learned who had taken the life of her beloved son. Over the years, Stephen's two sisters also passed away, tragically never seeing the mystery solved. James was the last immediate family member still alive, and he had nearly given up hope. In 2022, armed with federal grant funding and new partnerships, the Cold Case Unit took a major step. They reopened the investigation in earnest. This time, they would attempt to harness the power of genetic genealogy to locate the identity of the presumed perpetrator. The sheriff's office teamed up with Othram, a private laboratory specializing in advanced DNA analysis, to apply cutting-edge techniques to the crime scene evidence. Othram's scientists performed forensic-grade genome sequencing on the degraded DNA from the 25-year-old evidence, creating a comprehensive genetic profile of the unknown suspect. With this new profile in hand, forensic genealogists conducted database searches, looking for relatives of the perp. By 2024, this painstaking DNA work yielded a crucial lead. The unknown DNA profile from Stephen's case was matched to DNA from an unsolved 2005 assault in Illinois. In that Illinois case, the victim had provided DNA evidence of her attacker, but the case had gone cold and the assailant's identity remained unknown. Now, detectives realized the same person who ended Stephen Edenfield in 1997 had also committed the violent assault in Illinois 8 years later. This cross-case link was a true breakthrough. It meant the killer was a repeat offender who had left his genetic fingerprint on multiple crime scenes. Importantly, Illinois authorities had once developed a suspect name in the 2005 assault, Brandon Gliha, who was questioned at the time but never convicted. Gliha's name was now on the radar of Florida investigators. They discovered that Gliha, now 47 years old, was living back in Tampa, not far from where the Edenfield slaying had occurred so many years before. With probable cause building, the investigators coordinated with Illinois law enforcement. Conveniently, Brandon Gliha had an outstanding warrant in Illinois on an unrelated forgery charge, which provided a lawful reason to pick him up. In early February 2025, nearly 28 years after Stephen's death, deputies quietly arrested Gliha in Tampa on the Illinois warrant. During the booking process, they obtained a fresh DNA swab from him. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement lab quickly confirmed what they suspected. Gliha's DNA matched the unknown samples from Stephen's bedroom. Confronted with the DNA proof, Gliha eventually confessed to his role in Stephen Edenfield's killing, though he offered a disturbing and somewhat convoluted story of what happened. And by way of reminder, this is by no means the official story, just one narrative told by a career criminal with a history of disturbing offenses. According to an affidavit later filed by prosecutors, Gliha claimed that he hadn't acted alone. He told detectives about a man he knew only as Chino. In Gliha's account, Chino was the one who drove the dark sedan and accompanied him to meet Stephen in the early hours of February 1st, 1997. Gliha alleged that Chino had essentially set up the encounter and that he had been brought to the condo for the kind of liaison that leaves ample DNA evidence. After Stephen and Gliha were intimate, Gliha said he felt violated and angry, suggesting he hadn't fully anticipated the situation. He claimed he heard Stephen and Chino arguing in the bedroom about payment, which hints that the meeting may have been transactional in nature. At that point, Gliha admitted, he lost control. He grabbed a porcelain statuette from the living room and hurled it at the back of Stephen's head. Stephen was knocked down but still alive, and he pushed back at Gliha, who responded by punching Stephen in anger. What Gliha described next was the most chilling part of his confession. He claimed that Chino then attacked Stephen with a knife, stabbing him from behind. Gliha told police that Chino stabbed Stephen repeatedly and also struck him with a blunt object to ensure Stephen was dead, so he, quote, couldn't rat them out. All the while, Gliha said he himself was wiping down surfaces in the apartment to remove their fingerprints. He also admitted to searching for something to steal since, as he put it, they hadn't gotten any money from Stephen. He acknowledged taking Stephen's gold bracelet and perhaps other small items in the hurried aftermath of the events. Importantly, Gliha denied actually stabbing Stephen. He painted himself as a participant who threw the first blow, but blamed the fatal violence on the other man. Detectives listened to Gliha's account but treated it with skepticism. After all, in nearly 28 years, no evidence of a Chino or any other accomplice had ever surfaced in the Edenfield case. The security guard's testimony and the DNA results pointed strongly to a single perpetrator. When pressed, Gliha could not provide full details to identify Chino, and investigators suspect that this accomplice may be a fabrication or an exaggeration aimed at shifting blame. As of 2025, the sheriff's office has stated that it's not actively looking for any other suspect in the case. Authorities believe that Brandon Gliha was the only offender involved in the case, and that he was the man who carried out all the acts that night. On February 24, 2025, nearly 28 years after the slaying, Brandon Gliha was formally charged with Stephen's death. Prosecutors, convinced by the DNA and the confession, moved to hold him without bond as he awaited trial. For James Edenfield, the news was bittersweet. He was 72 years old when detectives arrived at his door to tell him about the arrest. In a later interview, James said he didn't wish the death penalty on Gliha if he is convicted. Rather, he preferred to see the man live out his days in prison as punishment. Brandon Gliha is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, and I hope to have an update on his case in the near future. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick shout out to all my supporters on Patreon and through YouTube memberships. Also remember to check out my other channels, Lazy Chill Zone and Lazy Chill History, for unsolved mysteries and historical content, respectively. Early on Sunday, March 8th, 1998, the quiet of downtown Toronto was shattered by a gruesome find. At about 7 a.m., police responded to a 911 call from a concerned resident who had spotted a body in the rear parking lot of 130 Carlton Street. There, officers discovered the victim, a young woman suffering obvious signs of trauma. She was rushed to a hospital, but tragically she couldn't be saved. The woman was soon identified as 24-year-old Donna Ogilvy, a recent arrival to the city. It was a shocking and heartbreaking discovery. Donna was not only a young mother, but also 4 months pregnant at the time of her death. Donna Ogilvy had come to Toronto from British Columbia only weeks before her slaying. She split her time between Vancouver, where her family, including a young daughter, lived, and Toronto, where she sought to earn a living. In Toronto, Donna worked as a street-level escort, hanging out in the area around Gerrard Street East and Church Street, not far from where she was found. From the start, Toronto police recognized that Donna's death was a slaying and began piecing together her final hours, and the crime scene itself provided important clues. The details indicated that her last moments involved an intimate liaison that turned deadly. Based on the evidence and Donna's line of work, investigators immediately suspected that she was targeted by a client. Detectives canvassed the area around the parking lot and Donna's usual haunts, interviewing other workers and any potential witnesses who might have seen her that night. In 1998, DNA analysis was a newer tool, but the police managed to recover a male DNA profile from evidence on Donna's body and clothing. This DNA was presumed to belong to the unknown perpetrator and not a previous client. However, when they ran the profile through Canada's National DNA Databank, no match was found. The perpetrator's genetic fingerprint didn't correspond to any identified offender. With no immediate hits and no eyewitnesses pointing to a clear suspect, the case began to stall. As weeks turned into months, leads grew scarce and police looked at other crimes for potential connections. Donna's slaying was one of several attacks on women in the trade that had occurred in Toronto in the late 1990s. In fact, between 1996 and 1998, 8 women were slain under similar circumstances in the city. This spate of violence raised fears that a predator might be targeting vulnerable women on downtown streets. For a time, detectives considered whether Donna's attacker might be a serial offender responsible for multiple deaths. In the early phase of the investigation, one suspect did briefly come onto the radar. Just 3 days before Donna was slain, another Toronto woman had been found deceased under similar alarming circumstances. On March 5, 1998, the body of 22-year-old Christine Ricketts was discovered after she was working as a newspaper delivery person in the early morning of that day. Police moved quickly on the Ricketts case and identified a man named Adrian Clive Paul as a suspect within a day of that discovery. Paul, a Toronto resident who was out on parole at the time, was soon accused and later convicted in Christine Ricketts' death. Given the timing and Paul's history, investigators wondered if he might also be responsible for Donna Ogilvy's death as well. For a period, they examined possible links between the two cases. However, the evidence did not bear this out, and the DNA recovered from Donna's scene did not match Adrian Paul or any other known offender, and no other solid connection could be made. Further, the early theory that a single serial killer was preying on escorts also lost traction as years passed. The pattern of slayings didn't point neatly to one person. With no suspects arrested and no fresh leads, Donna Ogilvy's case eventually went cold. In 2022, investigators turned to forensic genetic genealogy to try to unlock the secret hidden in the DNA from the crime scene. They sent the DNA evidence from Donna's case to Othram for further testing. There, scientists generated a comprehensive genetic profile of the unknown suspect and used it to search genealogical databases for possible relatives. This process effectively built a family tree from the DNA, leading detectives to new investigative leads where conventional police work had hit a dead end. The painstaking genetic research paid off, and by late 2024, the cold case team had zeroed in on a particular family and then a specific individual who fit the perpetrator profile. Investigators learned that the suspect was a man living in Newfoundland, far from Toronto, which explained why he had never before come up in the original investigation. His name was Ronald Gordon Ackerman, a 50-year-old resident of Gander, Newfoundland. Crucially, back in 1998, Ackerman had been a young man living in the Toronto area, not far from where Donna was slain. In the years after the crime, Ackerman had left Toronto, and he spent much of his adult life working in the oil fields of northern Alberta and traveling back and forth to Newfoundland. Given his loose connections to Toronto, he had never been on police radar at any point during the investigation. Armed with their new evidence, Toronto police moved to make an arrest. Detectives coordinated with law enforcement across provinces and learned that Ackerman would be traveling through Toronto's Pearson International Airport on February 6, 2025. They decided this was the moment to strike. On that day, as Ackerman stepped off a flight from Edmonton for a connection, officers were waiting. He was taken into custody at the airport without incident, and in a press conference the next morning, Toronto police announced that Ackerman was charged with Donna Ogilvy's slaying. At present, Ackerman awaits trial on all charges related to Donna Ogilvy's death. As such, he remains innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. The authorities have also indicated that they are currently investigating whether Ackerman has been responsible for any other crimes of a similar nature. Given his vast geographic spread, discovering his further activities, if any, may be quite difficult.